All right, and with that, I'll give the microphone to Dimitris so that you can introduce the speaker.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm proud to be introducing Nicolas Langlitz. He's an assistant professor of anthropology at the New School for Social Research in New York. And he was actually trained as a physician here in Berlin, where he also earned his first doctoral degree on the history of medicine from the Freie University Berlin before going to the University of California, Berkeley to earn a second PhD in medical anthropology with fieldwork in psychedelic research. Based on this fieldwork, he wrote his, oh, sorry, I didn't know that the camera. So he did his seminal research that and published his book in neuropsychedelia in 2012. The book Neuropsychedelia, the revival of hallucinogenic research since the decade of the brain, which, as you might know, covers the preclinical phase of what we call the psychedelic renaissance. Then he dwelled into other topics, particularly primatology, did field work with primatologists, and publishing one more book on that, the Chimpanzee Culture Wars, before relapsing to psychedelics again. And he's now the lab founder and director of the Psychedelic Humanities Lab in the New School of Social Research. And he's studying how the development of novel psychedelic compounds and also novel therapeutic practices might change what we see in the near future of psychedelic therapy. And he's also, and I'm also very pleased that he's also engaged as a PI in the Psychedelics project, which is a project on the ethical, legal, and social implications of psychedelic science. And this is a project that is funded by the German federal government and the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. And we just had our first two-day kickoff meeting with some other PIs that are also here. And I'm really looking forward to work with you, Nick, and the other people over the next 2 years. But I'm, for now, looking forward to your talk. And thank you for accepting the invitation to take some more time here today. And thank you to the organizers for providing the setup. Yeah, thank you. But thank you very much for coming, and please.
Hello, hello. Yeah,
a little bit closer to the.
Like that. Can you hear me well? Yeah.
Okay. Now it's
all good.
Now it's have to make sure that we're on the correct screen. Okay.
But the sound is fine.
Test it again.
Sound is fine.
What do you think? In the back, louder?
I can also speak louder.
That sounds louder.
Okay, that's good. Good. Okay, cool. Thank you so much for having me. So my talk today is titled Psychedelics and the Crisis of Psychopharmacology. And I will give you a very brief overview. So the basic idea is that in the 2010s, we have seen a crisis of psychopharmacological research and development. And this has been the same time when psychedelic therapy began to boom again. And the question I'm interested in today is how psychedelic research has responded to this innovation crisis. And there are many ways in which one could examine this question, but I just want to focus on three that I think are particularly interesting. First, the resumption of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Second, self-experimentation. And third, computational drug design. But let me go back a little bit first. So originally, I did fieldwork on the psychedelic renaissance in 2005 and 2006 at two neuropsychopharmacology laboratories, one at the University of Zurich, that was Franz Vollenweiders, and the other at the University of California in San Diego, that was Mark Geyers. As you probably know, the revival of psychedelic research dates back to the 1990s, which then President George H.W. Bush had dubbed the decade of the brain. And there was a lot of hope that advances in neuroscience would translate into advances in drug development, and that they would inform rational drug design that would help to eliminate side effects and trade-offs in drug action. This neuro-optimism also went along with a lot of alarmism, especially in bioethics. People were very concerned about brain doping, about drugs that would make us better than well and would send us on a slippery slope to a brave new world. But in a way, these warnings still reflected a form of neuro-optimism because they assumed that you could actually have a drug that would make you better than well or that would make you smarter or whatever. So one thinker who advanced this sense of neuro-optimism quite significantly was the German philosopher of mind, Thomas Metzinger. In his 2009 popular book, Ego Tunnel, he argued that we would soon be able to identify the neural correlates of consciousness, which in turn would allow us to induce specific states of consciousness and treat psychiatric disorders neurotechnologically, and that included psychopharmacologically. Metzinger wrote that large pharmaceutical companies were circumventing the border between legal and illegal substances and were quietly developing numerous new compounds, and he had heard of more than 40 substances that were in the pipeline at that time. And he made a similar claim for underground labs, and I quote from his book, "The better we understand our neurochemical mechanisms, the more illegal drugs on the black market there will be, both in type and in quantity. If you're skeptical about that, I recommend reading Pikal, A Chemical Love Story by the chemist Alexander Shulgin, who had developed more than 200 new compounds in his lab." So just as a side note, Shulgin had actually largely ignored neurochemistry and had done most of this work before advances in neuroimaging ushered in the decade of the brain. So historically, I think this is to be taken with a grain of salt. So, this was 2009, sense that the future was wide open and psychopharmacology would soon be making some quantum leap ahead. And then 1 year later, 2010, most big pharmaceutical companies pulled out of neuropsychopharmacological drug development. So GlaxoSmithKline, AstraZeneca, Novartis, Pfizer, Merck, Sanofi, they all closed down or significantly cut down their investment in the development of new central nervous system drugs, because advances in neuroscience had actually not translated into successful drug development. Looking back at what they had achieved in recent decades, there was fluoxetine, that is Prozac, which came to market in 1986, and modafinil, sold as Provigil, which also came to market in 1986. And since then, most new compounds that entered the market had been so-called Me Too drugs, or as former NIMH director Steve Hyman put it, no more than variations on very old themes. So what was new about this situation, apart from sort of major pharmaceutical companies pulling out of drug development, was that it was not just the usual critics of biological psychiatry, but figures like Hyman himself, who had been director of the National Institute of Mental Health, who had basically lost faith in biological psychiatry. And Hyman's successor, Tom Insel, quit his job as NIMH director in 2015 to move to a new job in the life science division of Google X, now betting on the development of digital mental health technologies because he was also disillusioned with the state of psychopharmacology. In the wake of this crisis, various people offered various diagnoses of what had gone wrong. A quick overview. One prominent argument was that biological psychiatry lacked a robust neuroscientific theory, and that back engineering disease mechanisms from drug action had failed, or as Hyman put it, even if drugs that block dopamine receptors treat psychotic symptoms, it does not follow that the fundamental problem is excess dopamine any more than pain relief in response to morphine suggests that the original problem is a deficiency of endogenous opiates. Another argument was that there was an insufficient understanding of psychiatric genetics. The third one, that psychiatric disease categories did not represent natural kinds. There isn't really a thing out there that could be called depression or schizophrenia. Then a lack of predictive animal models was widely lamented. And all of that together led to an aimlessness in drug design. And industry argued that universities first had to conduct more basic science research before industry would reinvest in applied science and refill its CNS pipelines. Okay, so now the responses to this crisis in psychedelic research. The first response I want to talk about is the ascent of psychedelic therapy. So as I said, the revival of psychedelic research began in the 1990s. And in the 1990s and 2000s, most of the research that was happening served to establish drug safety. There was a lot of basic neuroscience research, and there was experimental psychiatry research on model psychosis. That's basically the terrain that I have covered in my 2012 book, Neuropsychedelia. Since the 2010s, clinical trials have begun, and as I said, that happened contemporaneous with the crisis of psychopharmacological R&D. And in 2017, the US Food and Drug Administration designated MDMA treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder a breakthrough therapy. The following year, they designated psilocybin treatment of treatment-resistant depression a breakthrough therapy. And in 2019, they designated psilocybin treatment of major depression a breakthrough therapy. So this breakthrough therapy designation means that a candidate substance is put on a path to expedited market approval, and the success rate on average is about 50%. You might have heard that MDMA has advanced pretty significantly since then and is likely to be approved next year. The case of psilocybin is still up for grabs. But this led medicinal chemist Jason Wallach to write an op-ed in which he argued that one notable bright spot in the crisis of psychopharmacology was with innovation and development of psychedelic therapy. Now, the use of psychedelics to catalyze psychotherapeutic processes wasn't really new in the 2010s. It actually resumed a practice that had been developed between the 1950s and the 1970s and had then been discontinued. And there is some historical controversy over why it was discontinued. But one of the more interesting arguments has been proposed by medical historian Matthew Oram, who argued that this was not because of the politics surrounding the counterculture, but because psychedelics proved to be incompatible with the emerging gold standard of pharmacology, and that was randomized placebo-controlled trials. Just as a critical annotation of that argument, FDA's breakthrough therapy designation was based solely on randomized placebo-controlled trial data, which raises the question, you know, if they were incompatible, psychedelics were incompatible with RCTs in the 60s, how come they suddenly are compatible with RCTs in the 2010s? But I think that that is an interesting question to be discussed in the context of this history of medicine, which has a lot of implications for how we view the prospects of psychedelic therapy and how we are going to assess the situation in case the trials fail. So in any case, this response to the crisis is not a radically new approach, but it's about taking up an already existing but marginalized practice. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is often presented as a paradigm shift that overcomes the limitations of existing pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy. If it is a paradigm shift, it certainly is not a scientific revolution. You might know that Thomas Kuhn basically used these terms interchangeably, unless one would think of a revolution in the strict sense of the term as some kind of a revolving notion where something comes back. Eduardo Schenberg is one of the people who made the case that we're seeing this paradigm shift. And he contrasted this paradigm of pharmacopsychotherapy with traditional psychiatric pharmacotherapy along three dimensions. First, therapeutics. In the case of traditional pharmacotherapy, a drug is administered daily. In the case of pharmacopsychotherapy, a drug is administered infrequently as sort of intermittent drug sessions which are part of a long-term psychotherapy. In terms of diagnostics, traditional pharmacotherapy assumes discrete and mutually exclusive disease categories, whereas pharmacopsychotherapy assumes a continuous spectrum. I think this argument is no longer true because DSM-5 and RDoC and other attempts to revise nosology in the 2010s have shifted traditional pharmacotherapy closer to a continuous spectrum. And then the third dimension is etiological explanation, with pharmacotherapy assuming a brain dysfunction, whereas pharmacopsychotherapy assuming a mental injury, which is to be treated holistically with both psychopharmacological and psychotherapeutic means. In the 2010s, we have seen an increasing interest within psychopharmacology in extra pharmacological factors, what Timothy Leary had called set and setting. And I suppose the most important extra pharmacological factor in psychedelic therapy is the psychotherapy. But then the question is, how do we study the impact of this extra pharmacological factor on the overall treatment outcome? Are we going to use the traditional methods of psychotherapy research? Are we going to supplement placebo-controlled trials by culture-controlled trials, which is what anthropologist Anthony Wallace had suggested already in 1959? And I think it would also be interesting to think about this historically. What are the differences between contemporary and historical approaches to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy? Because psychotherapy obviously hasn't just been frozen in time since the 1960s. What I think is quite interesting is that there are companies now such as Ellucis. I mean, first of all, there are a lot of startup companies, 600 to 700 have been counted, that are competing over this emergent market of psychedelic therapies. And one of them is Ellucis, which develops not only novel compounds, but also care delivery platforms for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, including therapy settings. So in a way, that is a form of extending drug development to extra pharmacological factors that impact drug action. And it raises the question of whether that might be a way out of the impasse of neuropsychopharmacological R&D. So this is a different imaginary of innovation, one which invents milieus and practices alongside drugs. Okay, so the second response to the crisis of psychopharmacological innovation I want to discuss is self-experimentation. This goes back, so there was a paper in 2021 by a researcher called Tricklebank which examines the different diagnoses of the crisis of psychopharmacology and offers a number of suggestions for how to move out of that. And those are, developing better animal models, using systems neuroscience approaches, getting better psychiatric genomics, and so on. And I was discussing this paper with a psychopharmacologist friend of mine who said, frankly, I think the only thing that works is to try out the drugs like in the 60s without the whole regulatory overkill. And in the 1950s and 1960s, there were a lot of self-experiments, and there were experiments on patients without informed consent. So there was a combination of scientific curiosity and scientific recklessness, which coincided with what is now nostalgically looked at as the golden age of psychopharmacology. And it's considered golden because between 1943 and 1958, LSD, chlorpromazine, haloperidol, imipramine, reserpine, and the first benzodiazepine were all discovered or invented within a time period of 15 years, basically. So if you compare that to the dearth of innovation in the time since 1986, you can understand why psychopharmacologists wish to make psychopharmacology great again by returning to this era. Now, the 1960s were not just the heyday of the first wave of psychedelic research, but they were also the time when regulatory oversight was significantly increased. There were the Kefauver-Harris amendments to the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1962, which was a response to the thalidomide disaster, which struck Germany actually worse than the US, but the sort of Contergan situation was pretty dire. IRBs were introduced in the US, and so there were lots of kind of regulatory restrictions put in place. Of course, the Tuskegee experiments with syphilis patients and so on. So there were a lot of scandals in medical research, often related to novel drugs, and those led to what that friend of mine called regulatory overkill. So when I did the original fieldwork on the psychedelic renaissance, I attended a symposium at the University of California in San Diego on the future directions in the chemistry of the mind with the Nobel Prize laureate Arvid Carlsson and Leslie Iverson, who was director of neuroscience drug development at Merck. and the underground chemist Alexander Shulgin, who I already mentioned had developed more than 200 novel psychedelics in a lab, in a shack on his farm in Lafayette, near Berkeley. His process of drug discovery had been primarily through self-experimentation and collective self-experimentation, which involved his wife Anne and a small group of friends. So when Shulgin was speaking about his own drug discovery process, Mark Bran, who was the CEO of the startup Acadia, which was funding this symposium, felt the need to explain, especially to the students in the audience, that what Shulgin was talking about was not as crazy as it might have sounded to them. And he said, what people don't realize is that what Sasha did was extraordinarily common in the 1960s and 70s. When people were testing compounds to investigate drug structure-activity relationships, they would taste the drugs themselves. The pharma industry, up until the mid-70s, knew this was occurring and that it was very facilitating of the drug programs. The perception was that people knew they were taking a risk, they were curious about the results, they were dedicated scientists who wanted to see progress, and they did it. But, he added, if someone conducted a self-experiment in my company, we would immediately terminate them because of the exposure they would create for our efforts. Now that we are in an environment where each step in drug development is hyper-regulated, if such an activity occurred, it would expose the company. So against this background, I was surprised when I met the head of a medicinal chemistry lab who told me that they were conducting self-experiments with new psychedelic compounds to determine their potency, the onset, duration, side effects, and some basic pharmacological properties such as whether the visual system would be involved. What appeared too subjective and context dependent to them were phenomenological characterizations beyond these kind of basic experiential dimensions like how much is the visual system involved. So this person argued that self-experimentation could reinvigorate drug discovery even if it would not be able to solve the multiplex crisis of psychopharmacological R&D as a whole. Now, this sort of turn to self-experimentation is a form of process innovation as opposed to product innovation, right? So you basically develop a process that allows you to have more, a new process that allows you to develop more new products. Although in the case of self-experimentation, it really is a process re-innovation because self-experimentation is presumably the most ancient strategy of drug discovery dating back to prehistorical times. Okay, now the third response I want to talk about is virtual pharmacology. This is a high-tech response to the innovation crisis, which is based on in silico drug design through computer modeling of molecular interactions between a target, for example, a neurotransmitter receptor, and drug candidates. And people are using ultra-large virtual libraries which contain up to 170 million compounds. So this is a little bit like Louis Borges's Library of Babel, which contained every book that could possibly be written with every combination of words and letters. Only that these 170 million compounds are still just a fraction, a pretty small fraction of overall chemical space, which is estimated to contain 10 to the power of 63 drug-like structures. One advantage of this approach is that it allows the identification of new scaffolds, so the core molecular structure, and thereby is a way to move beyond these minor modifications of a core structure of an already known drug. The first proof of concept for this was the development of two melatonin ligands, which had been selected out of 72 trillion drug receptor interactions to develop a new drug against jet lag, which was then tested in vitro high throughput screening and in vivo animal experiments, but there have been no preclinical or clinical trials yet, so we don't know if this strategy ultimately will deliver what it promises. But this, of course, is process innovation writ large, enabled by an increase in computational power in the 2010s. Brian Roth's lab at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill received $27 million from the US Department of Defense to use such virtual pharmacology to develop novel drugs that bind to 5-HT2A receptors like the classical psychedelics do, but which are without psychedelic effects because the Pentagon considers those to be intolerable. So the idea is to isolate the neuroplasticity enhancing effects of psychedelics and to thereby create a new class of drugs of non-psychedelic psychedelics or psychoplastogens. So this is a different kind of paradigm shift from the transition from pharmacotherapy to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. This one is about sort of shifting from a model where where psychopharmacology serves to correct neurochemical imbalances to the use of drugs to reorganize particular neural circuits and induce neuroregeneration. And this has led to a controversy over the question of whether the psychedelic experience is necessary for therapeutic outcome or whether it is an unnecessary side effect that should be designed out of future generations of compounds. And that, of course, has significant implications for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy because, the psychotherapy part might be considered either necessary because you have to work with the experience of patients, or, it could also be seen as too expensive and too impracticable for the Veterans Affairs hospital system or for mainstream medicine or the health insurance system. So a lot hinges on the outcome of that controversy. Now, virtual pharmacology, of course, doesn't have to be used to eliminate subjective effects. It could also be used to develop novel subjective effects. But if there are no subjective effects, then there's also no need for self-experimentation a la Shulgin. And if one manages to develop new scaffolds, that also makes self-experimentation significantly more risky, because in Shulgin's case, he basically used the phenethylamine structure and then sort of changed it one atom or one group at a time. So he always knew when he tried out a new substance that he had survived the last one, which was just one atom different. But if you have an entirely new scaffold, then you enter completely unknown territory, of course. This is use of computers to extend the scientific imagination beyond its all-too-human limitations. And the question is whether it moves medicinal chemistry into a space where it no longer needs personal knowledge-based, half-rational, half-intuitive approaches to drug design. Okay, so in conclusion, the crisis of psychopharmacological research and development remains unresolved. Big Pharma has not reinvested. And I've presented 3 imaginaries of innovation, each innovation model is part of a larger model of socio-technical progress that comes with a diagnosis of what's wrong with the present. In the case of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, the diagnosis is that the exclusive focus on neurochemistry is too narrow and drug development alone is not enough. And the cure to that is to extend drug development to extra pharmacological factors such as psychotherapy. In the case of self-experimentation, the diagnosis is that overregulation prevents researchers from developing personal knowledge of psychopharmacology, and especially of the psycho part of psychopharmacology. And the cure to that is to resume self-experimentation in the face of professional penalties. And in the case of virtual pharmacology, the diagnosis is that human imagination is too limited for the vastness of chemical space. And the cure for that is to use computer modeling of new compounds with ultra-large virtual libraries. I would think of virtual pharmacology of a classical modernist model of innovation, kind of modeled on the scientific revolution. So you take a cutting-edge computer technology which brings about a radical break with the past. I think a good example of this is Dave Nichols, who's kind of, apart from Shulgin, one of the towering figures of psychedelic medicinal chemistry, who in, I think, 2012 closed his medicinal chemistry lab and moved over to Brian Roth's lab, and told me in an interview that he basically thinks that the model of drug development that they had been practicing at his lab was kind of was exhausted, and the future was what was going on in Roth's lab in terms of virtual pharmacology. By contrast, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and self-experimentation reintroduce old practices into a new context and create the simultaneity of elements from different historical periods. For example, a classical psychedelic is used in a new form of psychotherapy, or a new psychedelic is studied in the age-old practice of self-experimentation. So here, successful innovation doesn't have to be imagined as a disruption leading to genuine novelty. It's really an amodern imaginary of innovation based on sort of a polytemporality rather than historical breaks. And I think these amodern imaginaries of innovation resonate with one variety of psychedelic experience. So Shulgin, after ingesting 500 milligrams of mescaline as a drug that Native Americans had been using for some 5,000 years, remarked, "Funny, I'd forgotten that what comes to you when you take a psychedelic is not always a revelation of something new and startling. You're more liable to find yourself reminded of simple things you know and forgot you knew, seeing them freshly, old basic truths that long ago became cliches, so you stopped paying attention to them." So I wonder whether this mixture of remembrance and wonder could inform an imaginary of innovation that points a way out of the crisis of psychopharmacology.